If you walk the streets of Oregon today, you might think you're seeing a localized tragedy, but you are actually witnessing the absolute breaking point of the American dream. While the rest of the country quietly celebrated a 3% decline in homelessness last year, Oregon saw its own numbers detonate by 19%, surging to over 27,000 unhoused individuals. But the most terrifying part isn't the sheer volume of tents lining the highways. It is the hidden demographic that has suddenly spiked by 62%, and who they are changes everything we know about this crisis. The 19% anomaly defying a national victory. To understand the sheer magnitude of what is happening in the Pacific Northwest, you have to look at the massive paradox that emerged in the early months of 2025. The United States, after years of agonizing post-pandemic economic recovery, finally registered a collective exhale. Data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development confirmed a national 3% decline in homelessness. Across the country, emergency policies and localized safety nets seem to be slowly pulling vulnerable populations back from the brink. But then, the data from Oregon was released, and it completely shattered the national narrative. Oregon did not follow the country toward recovery. Instead, it bucked the trend catastrophically, suffering an explosive 18.9% spike in its homeless population in a single year. To put a face to that percentage, that equates to roughly 27,200 human beings waking up without a roof over their heads on any given night. It was the second largest statistical surge of any state in the nation, trailing only behind a region devastated by the apocalyptic physical destruction of a major hurricane. But Oregon's disaster was not brought on by extreme weather or a sudden natural cataclysm. It was a purely economic storm built entirely by human hands and structural policy failures. This staggering figure of 27,000 individuals is not just a statistical anomaly, it is a blaring siren indicating that a foundational pillar of society has collapsed. But the most perplexing question that continues to haunt economists and social workers alike is why this is happening right now. The state of Oregon has poured hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars into emergency housing services, shelter expansions, and systemic interventions over the last several years. By all traditional bureaucratic metrics, the state is actively fighting a war against poverty. So why is a state with such massive emergency funding failing so catastrophically on the ground, while entirely different regions of the country begin to recover? The answer to that question lies not in the amount of money being spent, but in a deeply entrenched structural bottleneck that is suffocating the state's largest cities, rendering every emergency dollar completely powerless against the rising tide. The Multnomah collapse. To truly comprehend the gravitational center of this crisis, you have to look directly into the epicenter of the collapse, Multnomah County. When the federal data was initially captured in early 2025, the county reported a devastating 43% surge, pushing its unhoused population to 10,500 people. At the time, that number was considered an absolute worst-case scenario. But the situation deteriorated with a speed that local governments were entirely unprepared for. By March of 2026, updated local metrics revealed a reality that is almost difficult to process. The number of unhoused residents in Multnomah County had exploded to an incomprehensible 18,500 souls. You cannot simply read a number like 18,500 and grasp its gravity. You have to translate it into physical space. This is not a scattering of individuals resting on park benches. This is the equivalent of an entire mid-sized American town being aggressively erased from the residential grid and relocated overnight. It looks like entire city blocks vanishing beneath sprawling oceans of blue tarpaulins and makeshift wooden framing. It looks like overwhelmed emergency infrastructures buckling under the sheer weight of human desperation, where paramedics and social workers are stretched so dangerously thin that the system itself is beginning to fundamentally fail. It is a visual landscape of systemic abandonment. Yet as the visual reality of this urban surge becomes increasingly inescapable, a toxic and deeply pervasive myth has taken hold of the public consciousness. The idea of homeless migration. A widespread belief dictates that these thousands of people are out-of-state opportunists, flocking to Oregon's cities to take advantage of progressive social services and lenient civic policies. But the hard, empirical data aggressively destroys this narrative. Extensive local tracking proves that over 80% of the unhoused individuals currently suffering on Oregon's streets have lived in their respective local regions for more than 3 years, and a staggering 50% have lived there for over a decade. These are not opportunistic outsiders. These are the very people who used to pour your coffee, teach your children, and build your neighborhoods. They are locals who simply could no longer survive the brutal mathematics of skyrocketing median rents and stagnant wages, violently priced out of the very communities they spent their entire lives helping to build. The 62% blind spot. As catastrophic as the urban collapse in Portland is, it still distracts from the most haunting revelation buried inside the recent federal data. When we think of homelessness, society has been conditioned to visualize a very specific chronic archetype, an older adult likely battling severe mental illness or decades of substance abuse, navigating the streets alone. But the most terrifying metric in Oregon right now completely shatters that preconceived image. The fastest growing segment of the unhoused population is not the chronically ill adult. It is youth. In a single statistical year, Oregon witnessed an absolutely devastating 62% statewide increase in unsheltered youth. This 62% represents a fundamental shift in the very nature of the crisis. These are unaccompanied minors, high school teenagers, and incredibly young families who have fallen completely through the cracks of the American economic floor. Because they do not fit the traditional visual profile of homelessness, they are tragically invisible to the average commuter driving past the downtown encampments. They are the hidden demographic, desperately attempting to maintain a facade of normalcy while enduring unthinkable instability. They are doing algebra homework under the dome light of a freezing sedan parked behind a big box retail store. They are teenagers washing their hair in the sinks of public park restrooms before catching the morning school bus, carrying the heavy, silent trauma of their reality in their backpacks. To understand how this youth demographic spiked so aggressively, you have to look at the invisible collapse of the doubled-up safety net. For years, thousands of fragile, low-income families in Oregon managed to stave off the streets by couch surfing, cramming 3 generations into a 1-bedroom apartment, or sleeping on the floors of extended relatives. But as inflation squeezed the working class and housing costs pushed even stable households to the brink, those generous relatives could no longer afford the financial liability of extra mouths to feed. The doubled-up safety nets abruptly snapped. Families were abruptly handed eviction notices, pushing mothers, fathers, and young children out of crowded living rooms and directly onto the literal concrete. The 62% spike is not just a housing failure, it is a profound moral failure, representing an entire generation of youth whose developmental years are being permanently scarred by the trauma of street-level survival. The geographic illusion. Just as the sheer weight of Multnomah County's collapse threatens to extinguish any sense of optimism, the data offers a sudden, violently unexpected twist. If you leave the suffocating density of Portland and drive southeast into central Oregon, specifically into Deschutes, Jefferson, and Crook counties, the narrative abruptly flips. While the state was drowning in a 19% overall spike, this predominantly rural and mid-sized region achieved what felt statistically impossible, a 19.1% drop in homelessness by early 2026. This was not a clerical error, nor was it the result of pushing unhoused individuals across county lines. This was the mechanical result of a hyper-targeted, community-driven intervention that actually worked. By combining rapid rehousing initiatives, aggressive local funding, and the opening of localized permanent supportive housing, these central counties managed to pull nearly 300 vulnerable individuals entirely out of the cycle of homelessness. They expanded safe parking programs, optimized transitional shelter beds, and created an environment where city planners and social services operated with a unified, localized agility. For a fleeting moment, this 19% drop provides a profound, desperately needed glimmer of hope, proving that with the right combination of political will and immediate resource allocation, the crisis can actually be reversed. But this isolated rural victory demands a brutal reality check. The mechanics that saved 300 lives in Central Oregon are incredibly difficult to replicate in the sprawling, bureaucratic labyrinth of the state's largest metropolitan areas. While a town like Bend can pivot quickly to open a localized shelter or expedite a specific zoning permit, Portland is paralyzed by massive, structural bottlenecks. Decades of restrictive zoning laws, exorbitant system development charges, and a sluggish, convoluted permitting process make rapid expansion in the urban core nearly impossible. The terrifying question that emerges is whether the rural playbook is actually scalable to the magnitude of 18,000 people, or if Central Oregon's success is merely a geographic illusion, a temporary, isolated lifeboat floating on the edge of a sinking ship. 2035 and beyond. The fleeting hope of rural recovery completely disintegrates when you shift the lens away from the present and look toward the looming macroeconomic horizon. The crisis we are witnessing today, with 27,000 unhoused individuals, is the result of being roughly 140,000 homes short of current demand. But that deficit is only the beginning. According to the state's own rigorous housing analyses, in order to simply keep pace with projected population growth, aging demographics, and economic expansion over the next 20 years, Oregon must produce an absolutely staggering 440,000 new units of affordable housing. This 440,000 unit deficit is the economic tidal wave currently forming off the coast. Meeting this demand requires the state to build approximately 36,000 new homes every single year. Yet, recent data shows that the state is permitting less than half of that requirement, with multifamily housing developments actively stalling out due to soaring construction costs and restrictive local policies. If this massive gap between required construction and actual production is not radically closed, the 10-year forecast for Oregon is apocalyptic. We are looking directly at the permanent solidification of a deeply bifurcated society. The emergency interventions of today, the tiny home villages, the expanded shelter beds, the safe parking lots, are meant to be temporary transitions. But without an overwhelming surge in permanent brick-and-mortar development, these temporary sites will unavoidably calcify into permanent shanty towns, creating a permanent underclass effectively exiled from the traditional housing market. This is the ultimate heavy warning hidden within the data. The tragedy currently unfolding on the streets of Oregon is not the climax of the story, it is merely the prologue. If local and state governments cannot bypass their own bureaucratic inertia to launch an immediate, wartime-scale intervention in permanent housing infrastructure, the math is absolute and entirely unforgiving. Without a historic mobilization of resources, zoning reform and construction, the heartbreaking metrics of the mid-2020s will not be remembered as a crisis. They will be remembered as a golden era, a time when the problem was still small enough to be solved compared to the insurmountable devastation of the next decade.